Daddy, and switch it off?
With pleasure, my dear.
I couldn't bear it. It's quite a good tune, but 7 times in one day really is too often.
Oh, I don't know. It's very nice as a background if you keep it turned down.
Well, half a tick. I'll see if I can get any foreign stations. There's always a bulletin in English somewhere on the dial.
Germany Calling. The story of German propaganda broadcasts to Britain during the Second World War.
On this particular night, my brother took up his usual position with his ear against the radio and his fingers on the dial and said, "I'll have a twiddle. We might get a Frenchie somewhere," because you could get Luxembourg quite clearly in those days.
Programme 1. The War in the Ether.
Shortwaves don't sound too good tonight.
They sound horrible.
I prefer that Frenchman. You can get him on the long and medium both, I think.
Oh, it's past his time.
Suddenly, we got this horrible voice coming through in English, loud and clear.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Haw-Haw.
Here are the Reichsender ambush, Station Bremen and Station DXB on the 31-meter band. You are about to hear our news in English.
A sneering, smarmy, creepy voice. You never heard the like. It was horrible.
The diplomatic correspondent of the Italian newspaper Tribuna writes that England and France are spreading false and misleading rumors.
It was an upper-class English accent, full of vindictive pleasure about what was going to happen to our country.
Kept out of the war. The Italian journalist points out
an educated voice, a very sort of public school voice.
Founded because every German interest favors the maintenance of...
I was always trying to place it regionally. It sounded like a kind of middle-class northern accent.
Region, which is so important for German supplies.
It was measured, it was well delivered.
The message sent by the First Lord...
To put it simply, posh. Posh, which everybody understands. Not like the silly would-be English gentleman on the box. Just like a natural lecturer, definite, with a posh voice that you were intended to believe, and we did believe, didn't we? We did believe.
In the early years of the Second World War, the British radio listener was captured by the enemy. To this day, the voice of William Joyce holds a place in our collective imagination, but his nickname, Lord Haw-Haw, implies that he was treated as a harmless figure of fun. The truth is far different. From the outbreak of war in 1939 to the Blitz in the autumn of 1940, his broadcasts frightened and angered the authorities. By January 1940, 6 million people tuned in regularly to hear the voice of Haw-Haw on German news bulletins. The BBC's historian, Asa Briggs, points out that the initial success of German radio owed much to the BBC itself.
It put on the dreariest programmes imaginable. They really bored people. They consisted of short news bulletins, not telling you anything, of very, very large numbers of public announcements, as many as an hour's worth of public announcements at a time, of incessant playing of the cinema organ by Sandy McPherson, of virtually no humorous programmes of any kind, no serious music, very, very heavy fare.
Oh, God. Sandy McPherson used to drive us mad. Almost every opportunity you heard this wretched man with his infernal organ groaning away.
In 1939, Eric Westman was a 15-year-old schoolboy living in a small Somerset village. In Leicestershire, another schoolboy radio buff, Frank Loxley, remembers the tedium of the BBC's output.
And his music was always tremendously soporific. He would be playing things like lullabies and traumerei and so on.
Closing of places of entertainment. All cinemas, theatres, and other places of entertainment are to be closed immediately until further notice. They are being closed because if they were hit by a bomb, large numbers would be killed or injured.
So this was just an alternation between grim news bulletins and this tremendously slow, soporific music.
So it was no surprise that people tuned into Germany.
Oh, no surprise at all.
Broadcasts from Berlin to Britain were not confined to news and talks featuring William Joyce alone. A large staff of British fascists and English-speaking Germans produced a wide range of programs, concerts, cultural talks, even a woman's show, all designed to promote the Nazi way of life and to highlight the social problems existing in Britain. But the staple was the news, a curious mixture of factual narrative and Nazi comment.
A time check first before we start. 5 seconds to go, and with the sound of the gong it will be 6 minutes past midnight Berlin time. The latest news from Berlin. In commenting upon the Führer's speech of today and upon the situation in Germany...
There were also dialogues and sketches, painfully long, and with the possible exception of William Joyce, abysmally acted. This one, recorded in March 1940, depicts an imaginary scene in the Ministry of Information in London.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning. Good morning, Rogers. Good morning, Mr. Brown. I'm so pleased to see you. What can I do for you, gentlemen?
William Joyce takes the part of an imaginary Jewish refugee, Dr. Jacob Goldstein, meeting two gullible British officials. The gross anti-Semitism of the sketch is a mild example of one of the constant themes of German broadcasts to Britain.
Never mind the army, Dr. Goldstein. Goldstein? No more. Please, gentlemen, don't call me Goldstein anymore. I've changed my name by deed poll. Jim Gorringe. I had to retain the initials.
But to be short and sweet, Mr. Gorringe.
I was always rather thrilled by this little contact with the enemy. We lived such simple, narrow lives in those days. Anything foreign was mysterious and wonderful and romantic to us.
Die Ansprache des Reichsmarschalls Hermann Göring an die deutsche Wehrmacht verzögert sich einige Minuten.
We were a little bit fearful, perhaps sitting in our homes in the complete darkness outside. Sometimes we'd hear German planes go over. There was always the fear of something dropping out of the sky through the darkness on us.
In December 1939, a worried anti-aircraft commander wrote to the force's adjutant general, complaining about the subversive effect of Haw-Haw. The nightly broadcast, he said, is most insidious and is nothing more or less than an attempt to foment a social revolution. The nub of the problem, in his view, was that the BBC hadn't found a voice with the right mass appeal. There are a large number of very talented men, he suggested, who every Sunday take up their positions at Hyde Park Corner and speak on all sorts of strange subjects. These gentlemen are worth a guinea a minute to listen to. They have lovely common voices, and they do know their stuff.
It was not only the generals of the anti-aircraft command or other bits of the army who were complaining in the spring of 1940, it was employers also. And there's a very interesting letter here from an employer writing from Leeds, in which he says, I refer to the most serious and pernicious effects, the nightly insidious semi-truths coupled with lying in the most ingenious and subtle manner that the Haw-Haw broadcasts are having amongst the working classes in this part of the country, particularly their women folk. As manager to a very large firm in this city, employing over 600 hands and with over 40 years close contact with the working classes, I'm appalled at the accumulating and increasing interest taken by them in this swine's broadcasts. Even my own maids and charwomen are becoming tainted.
We are not surprised to learn that panic and confusion are hourly gaining ground in Britain. The only wonder is that the people of this doomed island took so long to realize the nature of the position into which their politicians had led them. But now, realization seems to have come with a vengeance. The rich, the wealthy, the plutocratic caste are now seeking safety in flight. A flood of affluent refugees.
He goes on to say, and it's a very powerful phrase, that hellish yeast was being produced at work in the towns and cities of our country. And I wish to warn the government that a great deal of trouble is brewing and the times ahead of us may be very difficult on the home front.
It's a desertion by that very class in whose interest the war was provoked. As true internationalists, they use England for their own purposes. And now, for the worst is about to come to the world, may quietly vanish from the scene.
Another difficulty arising from the broadcasts was the extraordinary number of rumours which spread throughout Britain almost from the very start of the war. Haw-Haw, it seems, had superhuman powers.
Well, I was in Eastbourne in 1939, and I heard Lord Haw-Haw say, "It won't be long before we're over in England, and we know quite a lot about what's going on all round the southeastern corner. In fact, we know something about Eastbourne. We know that your clock on the town hall is 5 minutes slow this week." So I presume they had their spies over here.
Did you distinctly remember hearing that?
Distinctly, it stayed with me all that time. It's one of the things, there are a lot of other things that stuck in my memory, but that is a distinct thing that I remember.
Then you'd have a voice break in and saying, "Germany calling, this is Germany calling," and then he would start telling us.
Meanwhile, in Hertfordshire, Haw-Haw had designs on a factory which produced a well-known breakfast cereal.
He said, "Oh, and we know all about the shredded wheat in Waning City. We do not intend to bomb the shredded wheat because we shall need that after the war." Waning City, shredded wheat, you know, couldn't believe it at first, and we didn't like shredded wheat. So we said, as soon as he said that, "You can have it, we don't like it."
There's hordes of rumours going around at the time. I never heard any such thing. I listened to him most nights. I've never heard him say anything like that. I suppose there's something like the modern folk legends. And another typical version would be that Haw-Haw had broadcast that the town hall clock at Eastbourne or some such place was 10 minutes slow, and so it was. I never heard him say anything of the sort.
If Haw-Haw was said to know about the clock at Eastbourne, he was equally well informed about the clock on Fareham Village Church, or any other prominent public clock for that matter. Partly to try to stop the rumours, and partly to find out just what the Germans were saying, the government asked the BBC to establish a monitoring service. Its purpose was to listen to and transcribe as much of the German output as possible. The monitors, like Vladimir Rubinstein and Lorna Swire, have their own views on Haw-Haw's knowledge of English village clocks.
Rubbish. Rubbish, that's just typical. And he never said anything like that. He wouldn't have demeaned himself to talk about Fareham Village Church. Nonsense. That's typical, you see. Now, I don't think in all the time that he broadcast he ever mentioned any specific objective. He did occasionally say, "Well, it's the Ark Royal," you know, things like that. But I asked the people who'd monitored him before I got there, and they said the same thing.
It was absolutely clear to anybody who really studied, I think, the material carefully, that it was largely based on newspaper reports, which had been gathered, I mean, obviously forwarded from this country to, say, Lisbon or Stockholm, and then sent on to Germany. Because after all, you must remember, there was also the local press. If you took a local paper and extracted information from it, you could, in your talks, introduce certain facts which make everything seem extremely plausible.
Could it be that German radio would actually reveal specific Luftwaffe targets in advance? Many people believed that it did, and as the monitoring service found out, it was impossible to guarantee coverage of every single enemy broadcast, and therefore impossible to disprove that specific threats had been made. Those who remember the broadcasts, like Mrs. Hazel Brooke, who lived in North London, or Mrs. Ivy Macon of Manchester, remain absolutely certain that Haw-Haw did single out targets for destruction.
We just picked up the words, just a few sentences, and he said, "And tonight our bombers will be coming over Stamford Hill and Stoke Newington, so you have that pleasure to look forward to." He actually mentioned us, yes. And we looked at each other in horror. And sure enough, they came that night and they smashed into Stamford Hill. And after that, we started listening nearly every night to this horrible voice to see what he was saying. And sure enough, he would mention places like Battersea Power Station and the Oval at Kennington. And even one night he said something about Buckingham Palace. I can't remember the words.
I was down at my mother and father's. We were preparing to have Christmas together. My parents still had this fish and chip business just off Stretford Road. So, of course, we were in the thick of it, really. And, of course, we always had the radio on. Everybody had the radio on all the time during the war. And this came through, I remember, on the 6 o'clock news, take your last look at Stretford Road, because tomorrow it will be gone. In such a sneering, positive voice. And after that, various people coming into the shop and discussing this and feeling very, very angry and not believing it, of course, not believing it could happen. Yes, that would be the 21st or 22nd. You'll have your archive somewhere which will know the exact date.
Inside the Imperial War Museum's repository of documents at Duxford near Cambridge, the collected works of Haw-Haw are stored in box after box, each containing the flimsy transcripts of his broadcasts, millions of words stacked high on rolling steel shelving.
They are a little stiff, but...
Germany in German. No, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for Germany in English.
Yes. Right, Germany in English. What period do you require?
Well, specifically, we're looking for December 1940. We want to find a broadcast in which William Joyce is said to have said that a street in Manchester was going to be bombed before it actually was bombed.
9th of December to 30th of December?
That would be right, yes.
Here we go.
19th I've got here.
Yeah. 21st.
Here's one. Announcer Sinister Sam. That's the nickname given by the monitors to the newsreader. There's no mention of Stretford Road here, but here's an implied threat. The effects of the attacks of the past few weeks with their terrific bombardments are only the beginning of a great German air offensive. These attacks will be continued until every British harbour and every industrial centre has been reduced to a mass of wreckage and ruins. So there is a general threat there, but not a threat to specific towns or places or times where bombings will occur.
Yes, here's one from the 27th, referring to a raid in Manchester on the 23rd.
Oh, yes. Well, that's the very raid which Mrs. Macon refers to, isn't it?
That's when it began, the 23rd of December, and on into the 24th, into Christmas Eve, 1940. All hell let loose. My parents' premises were demolished and my brother was killed. And next door was a little sweet shop and the babies were buried. It was horrible. Horrible.
And it says here, in the news, this is news by Oxford accent, in the early hours of the morning of December 23rd, Manchester shared the fate of London, Coventry, Birmingham, Bristol and Liverpool, when this city experienced its first annihilating mass attack from the air. A German airman who took part in the attack has stated that on the approach flight he was guided by a telltale glow which was visible when he was still an hour's flying away from the town. Then the pilot went on, despite the fact that British anti-aircraft batteries made desperate attempts to avert the disaster. We dropped our bombs, he said, with great precision. It was a grandiose but terrible spectacle. Faced with the success of Haw-Haw, the BBC was forced to take action. The press and the government were insistent. The corporation must strike back. but the question was how. The director of the Scottish region suggested that popular shows such as Gracie Fields or Bandwagon should be transmitted at the same time as Haw-Haw's talks. One ill-informed civil servant from the War Office went so far as to suggest talks by P.G. Woodhouse, who was at that time regrettably unavailable.
Now, the idea of laughing him out of existence really does figure quite prominently in a number of BBC memoranda in the winter of 1939 and the spring of 1940. For example, it might have thought that you could insert into Arthur Askey's comedy programmes a section which really would be a broadcast by Haw-Haw, a real broadcast from Haw-Haw, inserted into the middle of the programme, and Askey and his chums would really laugh it out of existence. There was also the idea that you could really develop an elaborate number of jokes about Haw-Haw.
This is the BBC Home Service and Forces programme. Tonight we present that popular radio show, Itmar.
We just look forward every week to Itmar. It was such a marvellous show.
Well, good evening, everybody, from the Palace, Manchester. I'm sure you're all delighted to welcome Itmar back to the air, and the overture...
Yeah, there was Mrs. Mott and Jack Train. He was part of Itmar.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling. People of Manchester, ask your local member of Parliament, where is Flatiron Market? You will probably be surprised to know that during the last night, a fleet of our Messerschmitts blew Flatiron Market into Piccadilly. Of the 26 planes that went over, 28 returned safely.
But there were some people who didn't think that he was a joke, and probably they were the more important people, and they felt that there should be a reply to Haw-Haw. And so there were different ideas also then about what form the reply should take. Some people felt that the best thing to do was to put on somebody who could talk about the way in which English society to some extent worked and how we didn't like propaganda, and who would really have been able to put forward a very logical set of statements in reply to what seemed to be rational ideas being put out by Haw-Haw.
Suspicion among us. To do this, the Nazi broadcasters adopt all sorts of tricks. The number of these tricks is, of course, enormous.
Programs like The Voice of the Nazi rather ponderously attempted to demonstrate the propaganda tactics used by Haw-Haw.
The first trick is to refer repeatedly to things like bacon and butter shortage, blackout inconveniences and dangers, evacuation difficulties, and all the other hardships of wartime, especially those that directly affect women, for it's women that this trick is specially aimed at.
Funny. Mother gets quite angry if I dare to tune in anything outside the home service. I say, while she's out of the room, let's see if Lord Haw-Haw's still on the air. You don't hear so much about him nowadays.
In a feature series called The War in the Ether, dramatized scenes showed how a typical family, father, mother, Bill and Mary, reacted to the enemy voice in their living room.
But now they will get the war which they desired to its bitter end.
With the cocoa. William? I can't think why you listen to that dreadful person.
Well, it's good entertainment. Well, once in a while. As good as music hall.
Well, I'm like Mother. He makes me furious.
It's funny. I've noticed he generally makes women very angry. A man has a different outlook from a woman. He's interested to see what sort of a performance the other side's putting up. Personally, I don't think these foreign propaganda broadcasts make a ha'porth of difference.
I don't agree. I think that's terribly serious.
Well, I'm inclined to think Mother's right. They're terribly serious.
I still don't think they make
And I am wondering why the usual technique of British propaganda has on this occasion gone wrong. Some pundit of the British Broadcasting Corporation had the calm assurance to deliver the day before yesterday a military appreciation in which he said that the British tactics were not to be criticized. Of course not. Who could be so unkind?
In the hour of need, the BBC did find an authentic voice to speak for Britain, a voice whose regular talks had none of the condescending manner which had characterized so many of the earlier broadcasts during the phony war.
The other night, here in London, I did something I hadn't done for many months. I went to a cinema. It was showing an American comic film, which I enjoyed for what it was worth, but when it had been running about an
J.B.
hour...
Priestley had every quality, I think, which made him the right person to do the postscripts in 1940. For one thing, he did have very strong views about British society. He felt that there's something wrong with it. And he was prepared to talk not only about British society as it was, but about British society as it might be. And that feeling of hope which he engendered about what might happen after the end of the war was really rather a powerful element in Priestley right from the very start. Thirdly, he had a perfect Yorkshire voice, a Bradfordian voice, very rounded voice, because it was a voice of somebody who was thought of as being a man of the people, who sprang from below and was not a creature appointed from above. And he also picked on themes which really were themes that appealed to ordinary people. When he talked, for example, after Dunkirk about the little boats, it was a really gripping talk.
We've known them and laughed at them, these fussy little steamers, all our lives. We've watched them load and unload their crowds of holiday passengers, the gents full of high spirits and bottled beer, the ladies eating pork pies, the children sticky with peppermint rock. They seem to belong to the same ridiculous holiday world as Pierrots and piers, sandcastles, ham and egg teas, palmists, automatic machines, and crowded, sweating promenades. But they were called out of that world. Yes, these Brighton belles and Brighton queens left that innocent, foolish world of theirs to sail into the inferno to rescue our soldiers.
As the bloody and battered fragments of what was once the British Expeditionary Force drift back in wreckage to the shores of England, it is not impossible that the public will turn savagely upon the men who have so cruelly and unscrupulously deceived it. Churchill and his confederates are acting on the assumption that the opinion of the British people...
As Haw-Haw's broadcast celebrated Germany's victories in Europe and Britain faced the prospect of Nazi invasion, William Joyce's hold over the listener started to wane. He was a victim of Germany's success. Faced with the reality of war and the possibility of defeat, the audience on the home front could no longer stomach Haw-Haw's sneering and crowing. The rumours diminished. Haw-Haw and his colleagues were forced to find more devious ways of capturing the British audience.
Regular listeners to our programs, when they hear this tune, will know that it announces an original contribution from one of your own ranks. One of the boys who 2 years ago went through the hell of Dieppe found time in the comparative comfort of his Stalag to compose this poem entitled Dieppe, 19th of August, 1942.
Taking part in The War in the Ether were Asa Briggs, Richard Bright, Hazel Brooke, Phyllis King, Daphne Leet, Frank Loxley, Ivy Makin, Vladimir Rubinstein, Lorna Swire, and Eric Westman. Germany Calling is written and presented by Dennis Blakeway and produced by Nigel Atchison.
In thanking you for your attention, I would remind you that our next transmission of News in English takes place at 9:15 Greenwich Mean Time and will be given from the Reichsender Hamburg, Station Bremen and Station DXB. Presently, you will hear our usual Saturday evening service in Gaelic from the stations Hamburg, Bremen and DJA on the 31-meter band.